What if I told you that everything you learned in school about the first Americans is wrong? Not slightly wrong. Not a footnote-level correction. Wrong at the foundation. Textbooks tell us human beings first set foot in the Americas around 13,000 years ago, walking south from a land bridge across Alaska, hunting mammoths with stone-tipped spears. They were called the Clovis people, and for almost a century, every American schoolchild has been taught they were the first. The story has been told the same way for almost 100 years. A small band of hunters following mammoth herds south through a corridor between two retreating glaciers. Stone-tipped spears, big game, a blank continent suddenly populated in a geological eyeblink. It is a tidy story. It is a teachable story. It is on every museum placard, in every documentary narration, in every introductory textbook of North American archaeology. It is also, as it turns out, almost entirely wrong. In a dry cave in the high desert of southern Oregon, and in a wind-scored rock shelter near a forgotten ranch town in Harney County, two teams of scientists pulled artifacts out of the dirt that don't fit the story. Not artifacts that nudge the timeline back a few centuries. Artifacts that shatter it. Bones, teeth, a stone tool, and something far more intimate that pushed human presence in North America back by thousands, possibly tens of thousands of years. The mainstream archaeological establishment fought it. They tested it. They tried to discredit it. And after almost 2 decades of denial, they had no choice but to admit what the evidence was screaming. Humans were in Oregon long before Clovis, long before the textbooks say anyone should have been here. And whoever they weren't supposed to exist. This is the story of what was unearthed, why it was buried twice, once by time and once by science, and what it means for the history of our species. The story begins in 2002 in a parched limestone landscape in south-central Oregon called the Summer Lake Basin. Terrain is hostile. Wind-cut sagebrush, alkali flats, ancient lake beds that haven't held water in 10,000 years. Tucked into the side of a rocky outcrop sits a row of shallow caves, dry as old paper, sheltered from rain, snow, and time. The locals call them the Paisley Caves, named after the nearest tiny town. For thousands of years, they sat empty. Or so the world assumed. An archaeologist named Dr. Dennis Jenkins, working with the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History, had been excavating the caves on and off since the early 2000s. The site had been dug before, back in the 1930s, by a man named Luther Cressman, who reported finding human artifacts alongside the bones of extinct Ice Age animals. The scientific establishment dismissed him. Cressman, they said, had mixed up his stratigraphy. He was an amateur. Dates didn't make sense. The orthodoxy held. Clovis was first. Before he became the punchline of American archaeology, Luther Cressman was its rising star. He founded the University of Oregon's anthropology department. He spent decades walking the Great Basin, mapping the human past of the American interior with a meticulousness that bordered on obsession. When he first reported, in the late 1930s, that he had found human-made artifacts mingled with the bones of camel and horse in the Paisley Caves, the response was polite skepticism. Within a decade, the polite skepticism curdled into open contempt. By the 1950s, Cressman's claim that humans had been in Oregon during the Pleistocene was treated as a cautionary tale. A senior archaeologist who had let romanticism override discipline. He died in 1994, still defending his data. He did not live to see the Copenhagen lab open the envelope that proved him right. That is the part of the story the textbooks gloss over. The man who first saw what was sitting in those caves was crushed by the institution he had helped to build. Discovery wasn't made in 2008. It was confirmed in 2008. It had been waiting in those caves for 14,000 years, and waiting in the published literature for over 70. Cressman's vindication is also a warning, because if the first credible report of pre-Clovis humans in Oregon was dismissed for the better part of a century, what else are we currently dismissing? What other Cressmans are out there right now, sitting on data that doesn't fit, watching their careers stall, because the gatekeepers don't like the answer? Jenkins went back, and what he found in the dust of those caves was something Cressman could never have analyzed. Something that, thanks to a technology that didn't exist in the 1930s, could be tested down to the molecule. He found human waste, not a piece of stone, not a fragment of bone that might have been redeposited by wind or animals. He found preserved human coprolites, dried, hardened human excrement, fossilized by the dry air of the cave. To anyone outside archaeology, that might sound like a punchline. To anyone inside it, it was the holy grail. Coprolites are sealed bundles of biological history. They contain DNA. They contain pollen. They contain the cells of the person who left them behind. Jenkins sent samples to a lab in Copenhagen to Dr. Eski Willerslev, one of the world's leading paleogenomic researchers. The results came back. What they revealed kicked the door off the building. The coprolites contained human mitochondrial DNA, and not just any DNA. Haplogroups A2 and B2, two of the 4 founding genetic lineages of every indigenous person in the Americas today. People who left those traces in the Paisley Caves weren't drifters. They weren't outliers. They were the direct ancestors of modern Native Americans. Then came the dates. Accelerator mass spectrometry, the gold standard for radiocarbon dating, returned a number that didn't just bend the timeline. It broke it. Over 14,000 years before the present. Calibrated, confirmed, replicated. At least 1,000 years older than Clovis. For most people, that number is just a number. For archaeology, it was a declaration of war. Maybe you're skeptical. Maybe a few old samples from a cave seem easy to dismiss. Maybe 1,000 years doesn't feel like much. Here's the thing. In archaeology, 1,000 years is everything. The Clovis first model wasn't a casual theory. It was an iron rule. It had been the foundation of North American prehistory for nearly a century. Every textbook, every museum diorama, every PBS documentary was built on it. The idea that humans crossed from Siberia into Alaska at the end of the Ice Age, funneled south through an ice-free corridor around 13,000 years ago, and spread across the continent in a few generations. That was the entire framework. Paisley Caves was right, the framework was wrong. And not just wrong on the edges. Wrong at the center. Because if humans were already in southern Oregon 14,000 years ago, they couldn't have come through the ice-free corridor. Corridor wasn't open yet. The glaciers were still sealed. Whoever they were, they had to have come another way. By boat. Along the Pacific coast. Or from somewhere nobody had even considered. The establishment did what establishments always do when their foundation is threatened. They attacked. First wave of critics argued contamination. Modern DNA, they said, could have seeped into the coprolites from later visitors to the cave. Maybe a hiker had urinated nearby. Maybe a rodent had carried in fresh material. Jenkins and Willerslev anticipated this. They ran controls. They sequenced the DNA of every researcher who had handled the samples. They tested for contamination signatures. They tested again. The indigenous DNA was authentic. It was ancient. It was older than Clovis. Second wave argued the dates. Maybe the radiocarbon had been corrupted by older organic material in the cave matrix. Maybe humic acids from groundwater had infused the samples with carbon from extinct plants. Team responded by dating multiple coprolites independently, at multiple labs, using multiple chemical pretreatments. The dates held. Third wave, and this is where it gets uncomfortable, argued that the coprolites weren't human at all. They might be from carnivores, wolves, coyotes. Maybe canned waste had been mistaken for human, and the DNA was contamination layered on top. Willerslev addressed this directly. Yes, canned DNA was also present in some samples. Caves had been used by wolves at different times. The human DNA was present in deeper, earlier layers with no evidence of mixing. The molecular markers were unmistakable, founding haplogroups A2 and B2. Not modern intrusion, not animal, human, indigenous, old. To understand why the Paisley Caves findings provoked such an extraordinary response, you have to understand the stakes for everyone involved. A senior tenured archaeologist who built their reputation defending Clovis first in the 1980s and 1990s was not going to gracefully concede in 2010 that the model they had defended for 30 years was wrong. They would not lose their job, but they would lose the citations. They would lose the speaking invitations. They would lose the quiet authority that comes from being the person other scholars defer to. In a discipline where reputational capital is the only currency that matters, conceding the point is not a small cost. So the reviewers got slower, the journal rejections got more nuanced. Editors who had previously fast-tracked Clovis-friendly papers began asking pre-Clovis submissions for additional rounds of revision, additional samples, additional verification beyond what any contemporary paper would normally face. None of this was a conspiracy. It was simply the way institutions defend themselves when their foundations are questioned. Bought the orthodoxy another decade. Meanwhile, Jenkins kept digging. Team published and republished, and replied to objection after objection in the peer-reviewed literature. They didn't blink. By 2012, when a second wave of papers confirmed the original dates with additional samples from new excavation layers, the resistance had begun to crumble. The world's leading paleogenomics lab had certified the DNA. The dates had been replicated across multiple methodologies. The story had bled into the popular press, and the public was paying attention. Paisley Caves alone was never going to be the killing blow. Pre-Clovis advocates had been winning small skirmishes for decades, each of which had been argued away. What the field needed was another site, a different kind of site, different evidence, dated by different methods, run by a different team. It got one. Drive northeast from Paisley for half a day, and you eventually find yourself in Harney County, one of the largest and emptiest counties in the lower 48. High desert here is a place most Americans have never seen and never will. Pronghorn antelope, sage flats, dust roads, and the occasional ranch house. Near the tiny town of Riley, in a windswept gully tucked beneath a basalt rim, there's a rock shelter so unremarkable that you could walk past it without noticing, called Rimrock Draw. In the early 2010s, a team led by Dr. Patrick O'Grady of the University of Oregon began carefully excavating the shelter. They weren't looking for anything revolutionary. They were doing what archaeologists do, peeling back the layers, recording the dates, documenting the past. What they pulled out of the floor of that shelter turned into one of the most quietly explosive discoveries in modern American archaeology. First hint came from the animal bones. Buried in the sediment were the tooth enamel fragments of creatures that haven't walked the earth in over 10,000 years. Camelops hesternus, yesterday's camel, a beast the size of a modern dromedary that roamed the American West during the Ice Age. Bison antiquus, the giant ancient bison, far larger than its modern descendants, with horns that spanned 6 feet from tip to tip. These were not casual finds. These were animals from a vanished world. But the bones weren't the discovery. Discovery was where they sat. Above the bones, sealing them in place like a lid on a coffin, was a distinct layer of volcanic ash. The team identified it almost immediately. It was tephra from a known eruption of Mount St. Helens, and that eruption had a date. Geologists had pinned it down to roughly 15,400 to 15,600 years before present. Anything below that ash layer was older than the ash. That was the rule. Stratigraphy doesn't lie. Then they dated the tooth enamel itself. The results came back at roughly 21,000 to 22,000 years ago. Read that number again. 21,000 years, not 14,000, not 13,000. More than 21,000 years before the present, in a layer sealed beneath ash from a Mount St. Helens eruption that itself predated Clovis by thousands of years. By itself, that was already remarkable. Extinct animals in undisturbed Ice Age stratigraphy. But it wasn't proof of humans. Animals die in caves all the time. Bison fall into rock shelters. Camels get cornered by predators. Bones don't equal people. Then O'Grady's team dug a few more centimeters. About 10 centimeters below the tooth enamel, meaning deeper in the timeline, older, they pulled out an object that was not made by any natural process. It was a stone tool, a piece of orange chalcedony. Deliberately struck, deliberately shaped with multiple worked edges. Not a flake, not an accident of geology. A tool, a handheld implement that someone somewhere had made on purpose. And the style was unmistakable. It was a Western stem tradition piece. A tool tradition with a thin-stemmed base and a long, finely flaked blade. Tradition that researchers had increasingly come to recognize as a parallel culture to Clovis, with completely different tool-making techniques, completely different design logic. Tools was not Clovis. This tool was older than 18,000 years. The implications detonated. Let's be clear about what this means. If the dates are correct, and they have survived years of intense scrutiny, then a human being sat in that rock shelter in eastern Oregon at least 18,000 years ago, perhaps as far back as the same window that produced the camel teeth above it, napping a chalcedony tool from a tradition that has no Clovis ancestry. They were not the descendants of the people who would later make Clovis points. They predated them. They came from somewhere else. And here's the part the establishment cannot stomach. Whoever this person was, they were not supposed to be in North America at all. 18,000 years ago, the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets were still fused into a single continental wall stretching from coast to coast. There was no overland route from Alaska to the lower 48. The corridor wouldn't open for another 4,000 to 5,000 years. The only way this person could have gotten to Oregon was by sea, down the kelp highway of the Pacific coast, in boats. Navigation. With the kind of sophisticated coastal adaptation that no Ice Age population was supposed to possess. And if they had boats sophisticated enough to colonize a coastline halfway around the world, then they weren't primitive. They were something else. Dr. O'Grady, in interviews, was careful with his language. He talked about further dating, further sampling, further peer review. But colleagues, speaking less formally, were blunt. Rimrock toolmaker, one researcher said, was not Clovis. They were something else entirely. Something else entirely. From somewhere else entirely. Picture them for a moment. Person who sat in that rock shelter and worked that chalcedony tool. The world outside the shelter would have been almost unrecognizable. Most of Canada was buried under a mile-thick wall of ice. Pacific coastline lay miles farther west than it does today. The continental shelf, exposed and forested, threaded with rivers that no longer exist. Sea levels were 400 feet lower. The skies were colder. The air carried the constant low rumble of wind moving across glacier ice. Toolmaker was part of a small mobile band, almost certainly. Probably an extended family unit of 15 to 30 people, traveling along ancient routes between resource zones, the kelp-rich coastline, the sage-grouse uplands, the seasonal lake beds where waterfowl gathered in the spring. They knew the country in a way that no modern person can imagine. Every spring, every cache of edible roots, every game trail was carried in memory across generations. The chalcedony stone they were working did not come from the rock shelter. It had been quarried somewhere else, perhaps days of travel away, carried in a hide pouch, worked when the time was right. Their language is gone. Their stories are gone. Their names for the camels and the bison and the dire wolves are gone. The tool remains, and the tool tells us they were here. And here is the part that should stop you in your tracks. The Rimrock toolmaker was alive at the same moment on the other side of the world that European hunter-gatherers were painting bison and horses on the walls of the Chauvet and Lascaux caves. They were contemporaries. They shared the same planet. They lived under the same sky, breathed the same Ice Age air, looked up at the same stars. Western stem tradition that produced the Rimrock chalcedony tool is roughly as old as the Solutrean stone tools of Spain, the Gravettian Venus figurines of Central Europe, and the bone needles being used to sew tailored clothing in eastern Siberia. These were not isolated bands of primitive wanderers. These were full members of a globally distributed human civilization that had already mastered fire, weapons, fishing, sewing art, and long-distance migration tens of thousands of years before the textbooks gave the Americans permission to participate. That is the deeper insult of Clovis first. It did not just delay the arrival of human beings in the New World by 10,000 years. It quietly suggested that the founders of the Americas were somehow behind, somehow late to a party the rest of the world had already started. Oregon evidence corrects that. The people in Rimrock Draw were not stragglers. They were one branch of a global human family that, around 20,000 years ago, was thriving on every habitable continent at once. Now multiply this, because Paisley Caves and Rimrock Draw don't stand alone. They are part of a slow-building avalanche of pre-Clovis sites, stretching from Oregon to Pennsylvania to Texas to Chile. 250 miles east of Paisley, just over the Idaho border on a bluff above the Salmon River, sits Cooper's Ferry. Dr. Loren Davis of Oregon State University has been excavating it since the late 1990s. In 2019, his team published a paper in the journal Science, showing that human occupation at Cooper's Ferry began at least 16,000 years ago, possibly as early as 16,560 years before the present. The site contained hearths, stone tools, and butchered animal bones. It sits along an ancient Pacific tributary, exactly where a coastal migration would predict humans to have moved inland. Cooper's Ferry is not just another data point. It is a smoking gun for the kelp highway theory. In a normal year, the Salmon River in central Idaho is a torrent of meltwater that pours west toward the Pacific. 16,000 years ago, that meltwater carried more than mineral sediment. It carried information. It told the people moving up it that the country beyond the coast was open. It led them into the interior of a continent no one in their lineage had ever seen. Cooper's Ferry sits at exactly the spot where a coastal people, working upstream from the ocean, would have made their first inland camps. Location is not random. The location is the prediction. Monte Verde in southern Chile produced wooden artifacts, plant remains, and butchered mastodon bones dated to over 14,500 years ago. At the southern tip of South America, a hemisphere away from the supposed Bering Strait entry point. If humans were already that far south by then, they had to have been moving down the coast at extraordinary speed, or arriving on the continent thousands of years earlier than even the new model accepts. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, excavated by Dr. James Adavasio beginning in the 1970s, returned stone tools dated to as much as 16,000 years ago. Adavasio fought the same battles Jenkins fought only 20 years earlier. He was attacked, dismissed, professionally cornered. His dates were called into question for half a century. Today, most archaeologists accept them. Galt site in central Texas pushed numbers older than 16,000 years and produced a stone tool tradition with no obvious Clovis ancestry. White Sands National Park in New Mexico produced something even more extraordinary. Human footprints, captured in fossilized lakebed mud, dated to between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. Tools, not bones, footprints, children walking alongside adults. Barefoot impressions of human beings in the dirt, recording a single afternoon at the edge of an Ice Age lake, more than 21,000 years before the textbooks said anyone could possibly have been there. Buttermilk Creek Complex in central Texas, just downstream from the Galt site, has produced more than 15,000 stone artifacts in undisturbed layers, dating to between 13,200 and 15,500 years before present. Toolkit is sophisticated. Bifaces, blades, scrapers, projectile points. An entire technological tradition that predates Clovis and does not share its characteristic flaking techniques. The site was published in Science in 2011 and has been steadily reinforced by subsequent excavations. It is no longer fringe. It is mainstream pre-Clovis archaeology, accepted by the same institutions that spent 30 years denying such a thing could exist. Pattern is no longer regional. It is continental. It is hemispheric. The first Americans were not Clovis. They were not late arrivals. They were here when the ice sheets still covered Canada. They were here before the last glacial maximum had even ended. And they got here somehow. The question is how. For a brief and controversial period in the 2000s, a competing theory tried to fill the gap. It was called the Solutrean hypothesis, championed by archaeologists Dennis Stanford and Bruce Bradley of the Smithsonian. They argued that the first Americans came not from Asia, but from Ice Age Europe, paddling along the edge of the North Atlantic sea ice, from what is now France and Spain to the eastern seaboard of North America. They pointed to stylistic similarities between Solutrean stone tools and the earliest American points. Hypothesis was provocative. It was widely covered in the press. And by the late 2010s, DNA evidence had effectively killed it. Genetic signature of every indigenous founding population pointed back to Northeast Asia and Beringia, not Europe. But the Solutrean episode is worth remembering for one reason. It demonstrated that the field, when sufficiently desperate, was willing to consider transoceanic migration in small boats during the Ice Age. The same field that had dismissed the idea of Pacific coastal migration as fantasy was suddenly entertaining the idea of Atlantic ice edge migration as plausible. The intellectual permission slip had been written, and once it was written, the coastal Pacific model, which had vastly more genetic and archaeological support, became impossible to keep arguing against. There is another piece of evidence that quietly demolished the old model from a completely different angle: genetics. In 2014, researchers published the full genome of a Clovis-era child known as Anzac I, an infant burial recovered in Montana, dated to about 12,700 years ago. The genome was supposed to settle the debate in favor of the traditional Clovis narrative. Instead, it did the opposite. Anzac I was genetically a direct ancestor of most indigenous peoples in Central and South America today. But the analysis showed that the deep ancestral split that gave rise to Anzac had occurred far earlier than the Clovis arrival date. Modeling suggested a North American founding population that had already been on the continent, isolated and diversifying, for thousands of years before the burial took place. The genetic clock was telling the same story as the coprolites in Oregon and the footprints in New Mexico. The founders got here long before Clovis. Clovis was not the beginning. Clovis was just the first technology we happen to name. That same year, a septogenomic study sequenced the so-called Kennewick Man, an 8,500-year-old skeleton recovered from a riverbank in Washington state that had been at the center of a decades-long legal battle between scientists and Native American tribes. DNA confirmed what the tribes had said all along. Kennewick Man was their relative. He belonged to them. The deep ancestry of the people who had been in the Pacific Northwest for millennia ran directly through him. The science finally caught up with what the tribes had been saying since the moment the skeleton was pulled out of the mud. Genetic record, the archaeological record, and the oral record were converging on the same answer from three independent directions. That kind of convergence is hard to dismiss as coincidence. For decades, anyone who challenged Clovis first in print was risking their career. Vance Haynes, the geologist who effectively codified the Clovis first model in the 1960s, was a towering figure in American archaeology. Question him was to court professional exile. Graduate students whispered about it. Senior researchers learned to write around it. Sites that produced older dates were re-examined, redated, sometimes quietly buried. The orthodoxy held because the orthodoxy punished dissent. But the dissent kept coming, and the evidence kept piling up. And eventually, even the most senior gatekeepers had to admit the model was breaking. By the mid-2010s, the Society for American Archaeology had quietly retired the term Clovis first in its mainstream literature. By the 2020s, the dominant model had shifted to the so-called coastal migration theory, the idea that the first Americans came down the Pacific Rim in boats, hugging the coastline from Beringia to South America, exploiting the rich kelp forest ecosystems for food along the way. It explains the timing. It explains the geographic spread. It explains why early sites cluster on western coastlines and inland river valleys that drain to the sea. It raises a problem nobody wants to talk about. Because if the first Americans were coastal mariners 20,000 years ago, then they were not the simple hunter-gatherers of the textbook. They were a maritime people, they had watercraft, they had navigational knowledge. They had the technological sophistication to colonize one of the most demanding coastlines on Earth in the middle of an ice age, with infants and elders in tow. That is not a primitive culture, that is an advanced one. And our entire model of late Paleolithic humans has no room for it. Try to imagine the journey. A small group of families pushes off from a beach somewhere along the southern edge of what is now Beringia. Boats are most likely skin-on-frame craft, light, flexible, sealed with animal fat. Carry dried fish, water and stomach pouches, fire-making tools, perhaps a few dogs. They follow the coast, which at the height of the last ice age was a continuous, unbroken ribbon of habitable land from Siberia to Patagonia. Kelp forests along that coast were among the richest ecosystems on Earth. Sea otters, seals, salmon, shellfish, waterfowl, edible seaweed, everything a human population would need to thrive was available in a narrow band right at the edge of the surf. They didn't need to cross interior glaciers. They didn't need to chase mammoths through ice corridors. They followed the food, they followed the shoreline. And generation by generation, decade by decade, they moved south. The math is not extreme. Coastal population only needs to move an average of a few miles a year to colonize the entire Pacific Rim within a couple of millennia. If the migration started 25,000 years ago, by 18,000 years ago, there would have been people in Oregon. By 14,500, there would have been people in Chile. That is exactly what the archaeology now shows. It is a story so elegant, so internally consistent with the genetic and geological evidence, that the only real question is why it took us 100 years to consider it. Steelman the skeptics, because they deserve a hearing. Remaining defenders of the older model, and even the more conservative voices in the discipline, still raise valid points. They argue that pre-Clovis dates are often produced from samples that are easy to contaminate. Coprolites, they say, can absorb groundwater and the carbon it carries. Sealed strata, they argue, can be compromised by bioturbation, burrowing animals, root growth, freeze-thaw cycles that mix layers over millennia. They argue that a single stone tool, like the chalcony piece at Rimrock Draw, could have been carried into older sediment by water flow or rodent activity. They argue that footprints in lakebed mud can be misdated when the carbon comes from aquatic plants that fed on ancient dissolved carbon, producing artificially old readings. These are not bad arguments. They are the proper scientific response to extraordinary claims. The reason the pre-Clovis case is now winning is not that the skeptics were silenced. It is that the evidence has accumulated past the point where any one objection can carry it. You can dismiss Paisley Caves, you can dismiss Rimrock Draw, you can dismiss Monteverde or White Sands or Meadowcroft individually. You cannot dismiss them collectively. Every objection that worked for one site fails for the others. The DNA at Paisley is not the footprints at White Sands. The stratigraphy at Rimrock is not the wooden artifacts at Monteverde. Different sites, different methods, different teams. Same answer. Humans were here, long before Clovis, far longer than anyone wanted to admit. So what does this actually change? Why does this story warrant the word forever in the title? Because the implications cascade. If humans were in the Americas 18,000 to 22,000 years ago, then the global story of human migration has to be rewritten. Peopling of the planet, the great diaspora out of Africa, is no longer a tidy late Ice Age story of overland walkers crossing land bridges as the glaciers receded. It becomes a much older, much messier, much more aquatic story. It becomes a story of coastal seafarers who reached every habitable shoreline of the globe thousands of years earlier than we thought. It also raises uncomfortable questions about everything that came after. If the first Americans arrived 20,000 years ago, what were they doing for the 7,000 or 8,000 years between their arrival and the rise of the well-documented post-Clovis cultures? Where are their settlements? Where are their tools, their burials, their middens? Some of it is on coastlines that have been underwater since the Ice Age ended, and sea levels rose by 400 feet. Most of the earliest American archaeology is, quite literally, drowned. It sits on continental shelves under thousands of years of sediment, which means the picture we have right now, dramatic as it is the tip of an iceberg. Real story is below the waves. There is one more thread to pull, and it is the one that most Western researchers have refused to take seriously for the better part of 2 centuries. The indigenous nations of the Americas have always said they were here longer than the archaeologists allowed. The oral traditions of the Klamath people, whose ancestral territory includes the country around the Paisley Caves, describe a time when the land was different, when ice covered much of the world to the north and great beasts walked the land. Burns Paiute, whose homelands include the country around Rimrock Draw, carry similar memories. These were not myths in the dismissive sense the word has been used. They were structured oral histories, passed across generations, with specific protocols for fidelity. Western scholars, for the better part of 2 centuries, treated them as folklore. They are now beginning to look like memory. Oral traditions across the continent describe ancient floods, vanished megafauna, vanished landscapes, vanished peoples. Crater Lake origin story of the Klamath describes the cataclysmic eruption of Mount Mazama, which geologists have dated to roughly 7,700 years ago. An event the Klamath could only have witnessed if they were already living in the area at that time, which they were, which they have always said they were. If we had simply listened to the indigenous peoples, whose ancestors walked into those caves and rock shelters more than 14,000 years ago, the science would have arrived at the same conclusion decades earlier. That is the quiet, uncomfortable lesson of Paisley and Rimrock. The textbooks were wrong. The indigenous traditions, the ones the textbooks dismissed, were closer to correct all along. History has a habit of humbling us. The city of Troy was a Greek myth until Heinrich Schliemann dug it out of a hillside in Turkey. The Hittite Empire was assumed to be biblical invention until German archaeologists uncovered its capital. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Anatolia pushed organized human ritual back by 6,000 years and forced a complete rewrite of how civilization began. Every generation has its consensus, and every generation eventually learns the consensus was missing something enormous. Clovis' first model was that consensus. For nearly a century, it was unshakable. It defined how we taught American prehistory, who we credited as the first Americans, and what we believed about the technological capabilities of Ice Age humans. 2 sites in Oregon helped end it: a handful of preserved coprolites in a desert cave, chalcedony tool beneath volcanic ash in a windswept rock shelter. Together they tell us that the first Americans were not who we said they were, did not come when we said they came, and did not get here the way we said they did. They were mariners. They were here in the dead of the Ice Age. They were the genetic ancestors of every indigenous person on 2 continents. And they were doing something, surviving, traveling, building, napping stone, at least 22,000 years ago, in a place we were told no human had ever stood. That is not a footnote correction. That is the foundation of American prehistory, lifted out of the ground and replaced. Think about that timeline for a moment. Chalcedony tool from Rimrock Draw was napped by human hands somewhere between 18,000 and 22,000 years ago. The earliest known agriculture, wheat domestication in the Fertile Crescent, appeared roughly 10,000 to 11,000 years ago. First cities of Mesopotamia rose around 6,000 years ago. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built around 4,500 years ago. Roman Empire was 2,000 years ago. Everything that the average person thinks of as ancient history happened in the most recent 15% of the time. Human beings have been living in Oregon. For the entire span of recorded civilization, humans were already here. For the entire arc of the agricultural revolution, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the classical world, the medieval world, the modern world, for all of it, there had already been people in the high desert of eastern Oregon for at least 3 times that long. We are not at the front of human history on this continent. We are at the tail end of a story we are only just beginning to glimpse. And the most unsettling part? Chalcedony tool from Rimrock Draw is older than the oldest known cave paintings in many parts of Europe. It is older than the woolly mammoths that walked the steppes of late Pleistocene Eurasia at their peak. It is older than the agricultural revolution by 10,000 years. It is older than every pyramid, every ziggurat, every wheel, every written word. Someone made it, someone held it. Someone left it in the dirt of Oregon, in a world of glaciers and giant bison and yesterday's camels, in an age when the textbooks insist no human being should have been there. The next chapter is already being written. New excavation seasons at Paisley and Rimrock Draw continue. New sites are being identified along ancient shorelines, in caves, beneath the silt of former Ice Age lakes. Marine archaeologists are mapping the submerged continental shelves where the earliest American settlements likely lay. Every year the timeline gets older. Every year the picture sharpens. Every year, the establishment quietly retires a little more of the model it once defended with such certainty. What was unearthed in Oregon did not just rewrite a chapter of human history. It exposed how much of that history was never really written down, how much of it had been silenced, both by the soil and by the people whose job was supposed to be reading it. Stop and consider what it means that the proof was hiding in plain sight for so long. Paisley Caves had been excavated, and the artifacts described in the 1930s. Rimrock Draw shelter sat undisturbed in the Oregon desert for tens of thousands of years. The chalcedony tool literally 10 centimeters of dirt away from being found at any point in modern history. The information had always been there. The only thing missing was the willingness to believe it. That is the part of the story that should haunt anyone who cares about how we know what we know. Because if this much was waiting in the dirt of one quiet American state, what is waiting everywhere else? Submerged shorelines of the Pacific Northwest, where the earliest American villages almost certainly lie under 100 feet of seawater. Unexcavated caves of the desert Southwest. River terraces of the Amazon basin, where pre-Clovis sites have already been hinted at and dismissed. Vast unsurveyed interiors of South America. The indigenous oral traditions that have been waiting for somebody to take them seriously. Every one of those places is a sealed envelope, waiting to be opened. And every envelope opened so far has said the same thing. The story we were told is too small, too late, and too neat. Real story is older, stranger, and wider than any of us were ever taught. The scientists keep going back. They keep digging. And every time they pull something else out of the ground, the old story gets quieter, and the new one gets louder. There's a small museum in Eugene, Oregon, where some of the artifacts from these excavations are now on display. Copperlight in a glass case, a handful of teeth, a small orange flake of stone with a few worked edges. These are the objects that quietly ended a century of confident scholarships. They look like nothing. They are everything. The first chapter of American history was wrong. We are only now beginning to read the real one. The deeper we dig, the more we realize how much of it is still beneath our feet, waiting.